Senate Democrats blocked Republicans' bill to overhaul policing yesterday, calling the legislation flawed and a non-starter. The measure, which needed 60 votes to proceed, failed by a vote of 55 to 45. Unlike the measures recently introduced by House and Senate Democrats, the Republican police reform bill did not include outright bans on chokeholds and no-knock search warrants. It also did not touch on qualified immunity, which shields police officers from lawsuits. Here is part of the way Republican Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina, who proposed this Republican legislation, reacted after the failed vote.
When Speaker Pelosi says one of the most heinous things I can imagine, that the Republicans are actually trying to cover up murder, the murder of George Floyd, with our legislation. That's not politics. That's not a game to win. That's you lose, you will sooner or later lose. But immediately, every kid around the nation that heard that nonsense lost that moment.
Joining us now, the second-ranking Democrat in the Senate, member of the Judiciary Committee, Minority Whip Dick Durbin of Illinois. Senator, it's good to see you. You were one of those no votes yesterday on the motion to proceed to debate this Republican bill. Part of the argument, if we played out that full clip from Senator Scott, was Democrats don't even want to talk about this bill because they can't be seen as having Republicans on their side in matters of police reform or matters of the way African Americans are treated in this country. Why not vote at least to debate it? You don't have to vote yes on a final bill, but why not just talk about it with Republicans?
Willie, this in Chicago is called the old okey doke. It is a tactic that's being used by McConnell over and over again. He doesn't send a bill to his committee, even though he's chosen the members, the majority of those committees. This should have gone through the Senate Judiciary Committee, where it would have had fulsome debate and amendment, and ended up being a bipartisan measure, as far as I'm concerned. Instead, he brings it to the floor, and he says, I'll take it on the floor under my control. And that's exactly what he wanted to do yesterday. He didn't sit down with Schumer or any Democrats and say, let's work out a procedure on the floor for amendments and how we're going to bring this to a conclusion. It was merely checking the box as far as we're concerned. Now, let me tell you, at this moment in history, I can tell you, reflecting on my own life experience, something unique is happening in America and across the world, as a matter of fact, after the killing of George Floyd 1 month ago today. George Floyd's murder, 8 minutes and 46 seconds, hit us like a ton of bricks. And I think people have said, and they've shown it by their marching and their response, they're tired of this. They want to come out from under the shadow of racism, and they want something significant and historic to respond to it. What we had yesterday from the Republicans did not meet that standard. And we are saying to Mr. McConnell at this point, our Senator McConnell, we need for you to join us in a bipartisan effort that's real.
I understand your frustrations with the majority leader, Senator, but do you believe that Senator Tim Scott, who's been leading this effort on the Republican side, is a good faith partner? Do you believe that he wants reform to policing?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I respect him personally. I count him as a friend, and I do feel that way. But at this point, you know, there are forces beyond his control in terms of Republican leadership and their decision of how to handle the Senate floor. And I would just say that Senator McConnell knows how to get it done. I was in the Gang of Eight for immigration reform. I sat down with Chuck Grassley and Mike Lee to put together criminal justice reform. It was always a bipartisan effort. We worked hard to get it ready for the floor, get ready for committee. We know how to do it. It is a standard in the modern Senate, the 60-vote Senate. And McConnell knows that as well. And what he called for yesterday, I'm afraid, was just a symbolic vote.
And what did you make, Senator Durbin, of Speaker Pelosi saying Republicans are trying to, quote, get away with the murder of George Floyd?
Well, she has explained what that was all about, and I'll stand by her words on this. But we shouldn't let something this historic and this meaningful be diverted by one word here, one word there. You know, each of us who does this for a living counts on being a wordsmith at the right moment. Sometimes we're better than others. But let's not make that the issue. The issue is whether or not we're going to bring justice to America and end racism that we've seen graphically in the videotapes.
No question. Do you think that kind of rhetoric, though, is helpful in a negotiation as you try to get to the goal of reforming police and to helping African Americans in this country?
Don't forget for a moment, we're 3.5 years into a presidency where this president every 5 minutes tweets or says something outrageous that doesn't help the situation. But we ought to be bigger than that. We ought to move beyond any simple statement and say, let's get the job done. This generation is telling us, grown-ups, it's your turn, step up, do something significant to change America, and no excuses for it. I think that's what should inspire us rather than anybody's statement.
Senator, I want to ask you about DACA. Obviously, there was the decision recently, which is a start. Joe Biden says he would make it permanent, but what do you think should happen, and what are you worried about? I mean, we've got an election coming up. That could solve the question, but we don't know which way it's going to go.
Mika, I think last Thursday's decision by the Supreme Court, written by Chief Justice John Roberts, was the worst day in Stephen Miller's life. This is the man who has been barking in the president's ear about getting mean on immigrants and be as tough as you can on these young people, the dreamers, the people protected by DACA. Well, what the Supreme Court did was say that what the president's action was arbitrary and capricious. That's about as tough as it gets in the business of law. But he also went on to say, and I've read it very carefully, these are the things that have happened because of the creation of DACA. Young people have made decisions in their lives about their future, their education, their jobs. Employers have hired them and trained them and prepared them. Before you eliminate DACA and just wipe it off the books, you have to look at that reliance and address it directly. That's going to be quite a challenge for President Trump to do. If he has good political sense, he will steer away from it. The American people, Democrats, Republicans, and independents, are dramatically committed to these young DACA people. They are part of America and should be citizens in America. The president got it wrong, and if he returns to it, he's grabbed the third rail of immigration.
Reverend Dow.
Senator Durbin, certainly I agree with you about the GOP bill on the police reform, and many in the civil rights community had hoped the Democrats would block it. But two questions. One is that what is the next step? Because we still want to see some real reform bill,
yes,
like the House bill with teeth. Where does it go from here, and what's the timetable? And secondly, you're the senator from Illinois. We are just as concerned that you had over 100 people shot in Chicago on Father's Day weekend. How are we dealing with gun control and the problems of inner city crime at the same time that we're dealing with police reform?
Reverend, I'm glad you brought that up. First, let me say to your first question, there's a lot going on now off camera in the Senate, Democrats and Republicans, conversations, informal conversations about the next step, a constructive way to bring this issue forward and to deal with it responsibly. Our leaders on it, Cory Booker and Kamala Harris, good bill. I'm co-sponsor of the bill. I think it really hits the main points that need to be made if we're going to make significant and historic change. So I'm not despondent. We were set back by this McConnell tactic, but I think we can get back on track to do the right thing. The city of Chicago. I called the mayor just a few days ago and said, Mayor Lightfoot, what can I do to help you? It breaks my heart to think all these young people are being shot and killed every weekend in the city of Chicago. Well, at this point, one of the problems we're facing is that the whole criminal justice system is basically shut down because of COVID-19, the arrests and incarcerations and such. And many of the people who are the gangbangers and involved in this are back out on the street in a matter of hours. We have got to get the system of justice back up and working. But to go to a point I'm sure you know better than anybody on this presentation, we have got to deal with the root causes. What in the world is driving these young people to join these gangs, get a gun, and get out and shoot a 3-year-old, for goodness sakes, in the backseat of a car? There's a lot of reasons behind it, but part of it is their exposure to trauma. They're victims of trauma, are exposed to it at a young age, and it had a negative impact, which has to be addressed. We can turn these lives around, but we've got to make this part of the solution.
Mike Barnicle.
Senator, let's stick with this theme right now that you and Reverend Al just brought up. 106 people were shot in Chicago over the weekend. 14 of them were killed, including the 3-year-old that you just mentioned. The last weekend in May, 20 people, most of them young, were killed in Chicago over a weekend. They live in specific areas of Chicago, as you know. They're not living up on the Gold Coast off Lake Michigan. They're black and brown, they're poor. This problem is so much bigger than just police reform or defunding the police or redefining police work in America. When this moment that we're living through, this vital moment that began with an 8-minute and 46-second execution, a public execution of a black man, are we going to miss this moment and not get real about the root causes of all this violence that you just alluded to? Everyone knows what they are, and yet we've spent decades just talking around these issues.
Listen, Mike, you and I are almost contemporaries. We've seen a lot of things, a lot of marches, a lot of demonstrations, a lot of shocking scenes in our lifetime. I don't think there's been anything that has mobilized the American people like this killing of George Floyd, this graphic videotape, which I can't get out of my mind, and I'm sure you can't either. And the question is what we'll do about it. I missed out on part of Reverend Sharpton's question. He asked, are we going to move to gun safety? Frankly, dealing with racism and the justice in policing is something we can move to more quickly than even gun safety. Gun safety has just befuddled us. Think about your neighbors in Connecticut not that many years ago where someone walked into a first-grade classroom and killed those beautiful little kids, those first graders in their desks and teachers in their room. And that didn't bring us to gun safety and sensible gun legislation. That is a tough issue. I'm all committed to it. But what it takes to move the American populace and to move the American voters, we're looking for it. We've got to find it. When it comes to this policing issue, it's right in front of us now. There are no excuses. We've got to move on this.
Senator Dick Durbin, thank you very much. And up next, before running for office, Jamal Bowman had no political experience until he decided to quit his job as a middle school principal and take on someone who's been in Congress since 1989. Now, Jamal is on the precipice of winning that election. We'll speak with him next on Morning Joe.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.